Hello, everybody. I think we're going to wait for another minute or two while people filter up the stairs from below, and then we will get started. So, another minute or two. Welcome, everybody. Am I audible to all of you? If the microphone is not on, would someone turn it on, please? Okay. Welcome, and thank you for joining us. Some housekeeping details to start. Please turn off your cell phones or put them in airplane mode. And so you know, there are restrooms at the front of the group room on the ground floor of the building. Today we remember the flood unleashed by the collapse of the Williamsburg Reservoir Dam on May 16, 1874, and the 139 men, women, and children who died that terrible morning here in Williamsburg Village and in Skinnerville, Haydenville, and Leeds. You'll hear their names read out this afternoon. We also commemorate the many people who, having survived the flood or rushed to the area, brought assistance, or recovered and buried the dead, some from this church, fed, clothed, and housed the homeless and the relief workers, and set about the task of repairing the damage the flood had inflicted. The Mill River Villages 150 years ago had a diverse population, those from indigenous and old New England backgrounds, African Americans, some of whom had been refugees from slavery before the Civil War, and people from Ireland, England, Germany, and French-speaking Canada. All were affected by the catastrophe, but their determination to rebuild shaped the places our own diverse community lives in today. We're gathered to honor and remember them, but also to consider how our own varied perspectives and experiences can help us sustain and nurture the Mill River Villages for the generations that follow us. Roy Beals, the senior deacon of this church, will give the invocation, followed by Louise Mosrie Coombe performing a song she's written for this occasion.
Let us be in prayer. Gracious God, known to all people by many names, be with us this day as we commemorate that tragic event of 150 years ago, when a human-made structure that was supposed to help our community regulate water flow and prosper industry instead caused devastating loss of life, destruction of homes and businesses, and changed the landscape forever. The flotsam from that event made its way from Williamsburg through Skinnerville, Haydenville, Leeds, and finally into Florence, piling up in the meadows there. We have come here to remember the lives lost, the ones who did not hear the warnings. We have come to honor the ones who helped people get clear of the onrush, but were themselves dragged along. We honor the heroes of the day who raced downstream without thoughts of self and safety, spreading the alarm as fast and as far as they could. In this day and age, with instant communication, it's hard for people to picture the fastest means of communication of the time was carried on horseback. The telegraph, though started in 1837, would not have had a key and sounder at the gatekeeper's disposal. There are no doubt many family stories of the events surrounding that time. The tales of the heartbreaking task of recovering the remains of family and friends. Offers of help came not only from neighboring towns, but from other countries as well. Our quiet little town became newsworthy for a while, but not in the way the founders would have liked. The rebuilders were a tough and courageous lot. They restored hope as well as infrastructure, businesses, and homes. And now be with us, O God. Let us be inspired by these ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Amen.
I am an old man, village hill, watching over these souls and bones. My wife and son drowned, some were never found when the waters of Mill River cut through the mud and stone. I hold their stories in my that time may well forget. And when the sun shines on Village Hill, I remember them still. I fought in the Civil War down in Gettysburg. Watched thousands fall, but nothing I saw there could ever compare to the faces of the orphans at Town Hall. I hold their sorrow in my heart, these families torn apart. When they weep down in Haydenville, I say a prayer for them still. And the old maple tree stands like a sentinel, battered but still strong and tall. It's just another old man on Village Hill who sees centuries rise and fall. We'll hold these stories in our chests. May history never forget. When the sun shines on Village Hill, we'll remember them still. May we remember them still. Thank you.
Thank you, Louise. Today we'll tell the story of the Mill River flood in words that the survivors left behind, in their letters, in their testimony at the coroner's inquest, in newspaper accounts and reminiscences. Nick Reid Listowski has composed music that deepens the meaning of their words and honors those whose lives were lost.
Mill River is a little stream, noisy and turbulent, particularly in the spring, rising quickly after heavy showers and rain in the hills, and occasionally causing trouble. For years, the waters have been employed to turn the wheels of industry, and so for about 6 miles, little villages have grown up, which were created because of the cheap power furnished by Mill River. But there are times in the summer when the water in the river is low, and to obtain a supply of water, the manufacturers down the valley built a dam high in the hills to make a reservoir. It contained, when full, an enormous amount of water, no less than 600 million gallons.
About 5,000 people lived along the Mill River in 1874. Every morning, from Monday to Saturday, men and women began working in the villages and in the factories.
Ellen Littlefield went to the silk mill in Skinnerville to pack silk thread.
Fred Howard walked to the Leeds button mill to make boxes.
Collins Graves took his wagon to deliver milk.
Mary Hill was busy at home caring for her baby.
Samuel Wentworth went to the office at the brass works.
Myron Day hitched his horse to a wagon and drove an express route.
George Cheney left his cabin and walked on to the dam to inspect it.
Now about that dam. 10 years earlier, in 1864, the Williamsburg Reservoir Company solicited plans from professional engineers to build the dam. They were expecting a bid of $20,000. The first bid shocked them at $100,000, as did the second for $76,000. The mill owners rejected these and asked a practical engineer they knew, named Lucius Fenn, to write up their own amateur ideas for a dam design that would keep costs down. One of their ideas was for the earthen embankments to be built at a steep 45-degree angle because it would use less material. They asked Fenn if this was a good idea.
Will an upstream slope of 45 degrees fill with water without the earth sliding off?
No.
How about an angle of 33 degrees?
It would fill, but it would slide at some point.
We can fix it afterward.
Thus, the dam was built with steep banks, among other inadequacies. When sections slid off, the reservoir company added more earth and patched it again and again. Joel Hayden was so worried that he kept the water in the reservoir low. His son, Joel Jr., later admitted,
My father was always in fear of this reservoir dam. He believed it to be weak and dangerous, and 1,000 times I heard him express such fears. Several times I have known him to get up in the night and drive up to the reservoir to examine it so as to personally satisfy himself that it was all right.
The reservoir company hired a gatekeeper to live next to the dam, watch it carefully, and report changes to mill owners Onslow Spellman and Lucius Dimmick. In 1874, the gatekeeper was George Cheney.
I have been the gatekeeper for 2.5 years, and I have often seen small streams of water running through. It has leaked more or less throughout its whole length, the biggest leaks being at the lowest part, and one stream as big as a man's arm, about a rod or two from the outlet pipe. Mr. Dimmick thought it was nothing but harmless underground springs. My wife also watched the dam.
I told Mr. Dimmick about the leaks. He said, "Don't be a damned fool."
On the evening of May 15, 1874, Cheney and Onslow Spellman inspected the dam for the season. The reservoir was within 2 feet of the top of the dam, and the excess was running down the spillway. They pronounced it safe. Spellman went home to his house in the village just at the end of this street, and Cheney to his cabin at the edge of the dam.
The next morning, on May 16th, I visited the reservoir at about 6 o'clock in the morning. It was raining. I saw nothing peculiar. I sat down to breakfast at 7 o'clock. I was shoving away from the breakfast table when a great noise was heard. My father, who was standing at the window, exclaimed,
For God's sakes, George, look there.
We saw a mass of earth slide from the east side of the dam, about 40 feet in width and about 2/3 the height of the dam. I ran down to the gate and put the water on full head to release some pressure, noting as I did so several streams as large as my wrist issuing from the dam. I turned back, got out my horse, and mounted him. I rode to Williamsburg as tight as he could go, taking about 10 minutes to get there. I went to Mr. Spellman's house. The dam's breaking away!
It can't be. Which part?
The east part.
No, you can't mean the east part. You mean the west part, near the spillway.
No, I mean the east part.
It can't be. Have you raised the gate?
Yes, something must be done. Someone should go through to Haydenville.
You must go.
I can't. My horse is all used up.
Go to Belcher's and get a fresh horse.
Cheney rode away. Within a minute, he banged on John Belcher's door. As Cheney explained that the dam was breaking, Collins Graves, the milkman, on his morning route, drove into the yard. He could see that Cheney had been pushing his horse hard, and he wore a frightened expression.
George, what's the matter?
The reservoir has given way.
Do you mean it?
Yes, I do.
Well, if the dam's breaking, the folks below must know it. George, you alarm the folks here, and I'll drive down the river. I turned my horse, a little black mare, down the valley. She was a speedy little animal, quick-gaited, and I did not need to use the whip. I started her on the dead run.
Cheney warned the village until he was cut off by rising water and rode back to the dam, where his wife told him what she saw.
The dam seemed to burst all at once from the bottom, where the earth seemed to be lifted up. It made an awful noise, like an earthquake.
George's father said it was louder than the biggest clap of thunder he'd ever heard. It was between 7:30 and 7:45 in the morning. It took 20 minutes for all the water to rush through the gap in the dam. Above the village. While Livingston Bartlett was painting houses in the village, his wife, Sarah Collier Bartlett, and her daughter, Viola Collier, age 3, were drowned. Along Mill Street, the flood struck Spencer Bartlett's house. He and his wife, Saloma, ran out of the house and were killed by the water. But their daughter remained in the house, which floated 200 feet, and she survived.
In its presence, reason was too slow a guide, and instinct missed as often as it hit.
Collins Graves was just ahead of it.
I shouted as I raced down the river, "The reservoir's here! Head for the hills!" I gave the first alarm at James's woolen mill, where I told Tom Barazzle that he must alarm the factory hands, hunt up Mr. Birmingham, and warn him. Birmingham notified his people in the mill at once, and then went back to notify his wife and children. He and his wife and 3 daughters were drowned. I took off for Skinnerville.
In several minutes, the flood ripped through the village of Williamsburg, destroying dozens of buildings. It left 195 people without a home or livelihood and killed 57 people.
Sarah Collier Bartlett, age 24, and her daughter, Viola Collier, age 3. Sarah Snow, 76, and her grandson, William Tilton, 3. Johanna Downing, 54, and her daughter, Eliza Downing, 28, and her son, Edmund Downing, age 1. Mary Brennan, 62, and her daughter Mary Scully, 26, and Mary's children John Scully, age 3, and Mary Scully, only 8 months. Caroline Chandler, 39, and her daughter E. Mary Chandler, 8. Alexander Roberts, 42, and his wife Caroline Roberts, 37, and their children Nettie Roberts, 2, Olivette Roberts, 1, and Marianne McGee, 14, their servant. Susan Lamb, age 54, and her nephew George Ashley, 16. Electa Knight, age 80, and her brother-in-law Jeremiah Ward, age 71. Spencer Bartlett, 74, and his wife Saloma Bartlett, 55. Lucretia Johnson, age 64, and her son Elbridge Johnson, 38, and his wife Mary F. Johnson, 32, and their children Edward Johnson, age 8, Mary H. Johnson, age 6, Charlotte Johnson, age 4. Epaphroditus Hubbard, 56, and his daughter Emma Wood, age 21, and her son Harold Wood, age 1. Elizabeth Kingsley, 60, and her daughter-in-law Annie Kingsley, 35, and her children Nellie Kingsley, 3, and Lyman Kingsley, age 1. Mary Josephine Adams, 36, and her son William Adams, age 7. Henry Birmingham, 47, and his wife Laura Birmingham, 43, and their daughters Mary Birmingham, 20, Lily Birmingham, 16, Carrie Birmingham, 7. Michael Burke, 61, and his 3 grandchildren, Michael Burke, 9, Jenny Burke, 8, Annie Burke, 5. Frank Murray, 53, and his wife, Mary Hamill Murray, 53. William H. Adams, 51, James Stevens, 49, John Atkinson, 48, Frederick Burr, 34, Theodore Hitchcock, 34, Mary Carter, 23, and Archie Lancourt, 21.
When Collins Graves pulled up at William Skinner's silk mill, Graves's brother-in-law, Willie Rhodes, was standing in the doorway, and Nash Hubbard was coming out of the office. Graves shouted,
"The reservoir has given way and is right here. All you can go is get out of the way," I warned the mill workers while someone ran over to Skinner's house to tell him. Ellen Littlefield was a packer in the mill.
Almost immediately, someone in back of me said, "The dam's broken," and I jumped entirely onto my feet. I went back to my work, but in a few minutes, all machinery stopped. Something was wrong. I ran outside and there heard a terrific rumbling and saw a dark mass up the valley. That morning, it had been raining, so I ran back into the mill and got into my coat and rubbers. Then I ran past the boarding house and up across the railroad tracks. Several of the other girls ran straight across the road and up past Jerome Hillman's house, where his invalid wife stood in the doorway trying to find out what was happening. Mr. Skinner, who had not yet been over to the mill that day, came out in shirt sleeves and waving his arms about called,
"To the hills, to the hills!" I heard the factory bell tap once. I thought of fire. I jumped up to look out and saw the bank of water coming. Once I reached the hill, I looked back, and the factory was gone. It went like lightning. Bricks, irons, everything. It was a sea of foam and houses.
4 people died in Skinnerville.
Eli Bryant, 77, and his grandson, Joseph Hayden Jr., called Robin, age 5. Christina Hills, 46, daughter of John Kaplinger, who died in Haydenville, and Sarah Hillman, 42.
Survivors described what they saw.
To one person, the thick, coming mass of water seemed like the heaviest ocean waves. To another, the sound was like the tearing of shingles from many buildings, while a third heard it as the heavy sullen thunder which precedes the summer storm. It was preceded and surrounded by a dense spray or fog, dark and thick as the heaviest smoke. There was an odor like that emitted by stagnant pools. The wave is generally described as 20 feet high, though in one spot its spray washed the branches of a tree 40 feet from the ground.
Eugene Davis saw it as a boy and later recalled,
A great mass of brush, trees, and trash was rolling rapidly toward me. I've tried many times to describe how this appeared. Perhaps the best simile is that of hay rolling over and over as a hayrake moves along the field. Only this roll seemed 20 feet high, and the spears of grass in the hayrake enlarged to limbs and trunks of trees mixed with boards and timbers. I saw no water.
Collins Graves made it to the brassworks in record time.
When I reached the brass works and dashed inside, I noticed Samuel Wentworth, the superintendent, and told him that the dam of the reservoir had given way and that the flood was coming. Mr. Wentworth said to me with a laugh,
It won't be down here for 4 days, and when it does come, the water's not going to come to the first floor.
Samuel Wentworth was a man of more experience and greater ability than I, and I said to myself, if what he said is true, the people will laugh on me all right. And I turned around and drove back in the direction of Williamsburg.
But when Graves had covered a few hundred yards, he saw a man on horseback galloping toward him, waving one arm wildly and shouting,
Go back! A flood is coming!
Graves recognized Jerome Hillman and saw the flood looming behind him. He turned back, and both Graves and Hillman headed to Haydenville. They didn't see that 12-year-old Jimmy Ryan was also warning the brassworks. It took all three of them to get the factory to empty.
I lived with my father, mother, and several brothers in a house which stood just below where the woolen mill was at Williamsburg. My father, Thomas Ryan, and an older brother worked in the brass shop at Haydenville, and it was my duty every day to drive them to work. I had driven my brother and father to Haydenville and had returned home when my mother called to me to go up to Williamsburg Center and get some groceries before unhitching. I was just reaching the watering trough when I met Dewey Williams, who said to me,
Young man, you'd better go home and tell your folks to get out of the house at once. The reservoir has gone out.
I wheeled my horse about and started for home as fast as the animal could travel. I was standing up in the buggy as I shouted warnings to the people in the houses I passed on the way. I stopped at our house and told my mother and younger brother, and they immediately started for higher ground. My mother told me to go to the brass shop and get my father and brother. I did. Benjamin Munyon was on duty at the shop gate. I asked him to summon my father and brother and told him to warn the rest of the workmen. In 2 or 3 minutes, my father and brother came out, and we drove quickly for high ground. As we went up the hill, we looked back, and the factory gates had been thrown open for the workmen to rush out.
When I reached Haydenville, I gave the alarm. I yelled to the sexton to ring the church bell. I next rode to Loomis's stable and helped remove the horses and carriages. And then I stopped at the church and found that the sexton had not rung the bell. I asked him where the bell rope hung, and he shouted,
Upstairs!
So I went up and rang the bell. But the flood was then so near that I had to hurry to save myself. As it was, the church was surrounded by water, and I had to wade to get to the hillside.
I warned the men at Hart's barber shop and drove up Church Street to the railroad as the flood approached and watched.
Less than 15 minutes later, the crest of the flood struck the large brick buildings of the brass shop, and in 2 minutes, nothing was left but the smokestack. Only one workman lost his life. He was a Frenchman who had worn his boots to work that rainy morning, and had went back for them after he had gotten safely out of the building. He didn't, of course, realize what a chance he was taking.
In about 8 minutes, 41 buildings in Haydenville were destroyed and 27 people were dead.
George Thayer, age 5, and his brother, Freddie Thayer, age 1. Agnes Miller, age 10, and her brothers, George, 8, William, 1. Mary Kiley, age 59, with her husband, Stephen Kiley, 57. Rosa Bissonette, age 22, and her son, Joseph Bissonette, 9 days old. Teresa Pouzet, 45, and her children, Isabel Pouzet, 22, Ilacrane Pouzet, 14, Nyarene Pouzet, 11. Margaret Wilson, age 49, and her daughters, Matilda Wilson, 10, Rosa Wilson, 7, Margaret Wilson, 5. Mary Norris, 50, and her daughter, Johanna Williams, 22. John Kaplinger, age 73, Edmund Mockler, 55, Margaret LeBlanc, 54, Mary Hogan, 50, Mary Macy, 50, Teresa Taffor, 45, Frances Brojor, 20, and Georgiana Nafroise, 14.
The alarm to Myron Day of Leeds, who recalled,
That morning I had started from Leeds in a light spring wagon to drive to Williamsburg to see my sister. As I got near Haydenville, I saw Jerome Hillman on the other side of the river, gesturing wildly and shouting, just what I could not hear. I looked up the valley and saw it coming. I don't think that I realized that my life was in danger. The uppermost thought in my mind was to notify the people down the valley in Leeds. I turned my horse as quickly as I could, and I started down the valley on a dead run.
Between Haydenville and Leeds, the river flows through a steep-sided gorge from which Day and his horse could not have escaped if the flood had overtaken them. Day reached Leeds shortly before 8 a.m. He drove straight to the button mill at the bottom of the village. Fred Howard, who worked in the box room, described the scene in letters.
Dear brother, when we first got the alarm, I rushed into the carding room. After the carders and looker-overs were all out, I ran down the stairs and met Charlie, who shouted to me to go over to the basement of the brick mill and help get out stock. None of us realized what was coming. Most of the workers ran back through the yard, by the dry house, and up those stairs on the railroad. You will probably remember the stairs. They were directly back of the shop and were built for the hands who lived in the new tenements and the fowl house. That was really the only way of escape, and it's strange that so many should think of that way of getting out. Of course, some of them ran into the street and up the street to warn their friends, and most of them were lost. By this time, the hands were all out and gone, and the water was pouring over the dike and into the yard. As I turned, Annie Chamberlain, a girl that worked in the carding room looking over buttons, ran down the steps from the wooden mill into the yard. I shouted to her to come with me. The girl turned toward the mill when I caught her by the arm and fairly dragged her from the yard, reaching the railroad not a second too soon as the water was curling about us when we reached the stairs. I pushed Annie Chamberlain up the stairs and looking back saw Dave Duggan on top of the high fence that runs along the back of the yard and the water almost up to him. I shouted to him to jump. I waded in and caught him by the collar, and together we struggled to the railroad. Then came a scene that can never be described, and I hope I may never see again. When I got to the top of the stairs on the railroad and looked around, the barn where Quigley left his horses was sailing down the stream. The chapel was sailing like a schooner toward the railroad. The dry houses in Quigley's large barn fell with a crash. The new or wooden shop broke in the middle and gave one heave and fell. And in 5 seconds more, the brick mill fell too.
Nothing remained standing but the tall chimney of the Button Factory's brick mill.
All this time, other houses were falling or sailing down the stream, only to be dashed to pieces a short distance below. The whole valley was a wild torrent filled with men, women, and children, horses and cattle, trees and broken houses, the former waving their hands and crying for help till some timber struck them and either killed them outright or pushed them under and drowned them. We that had escaped were running up and down the railroad as helpless as infants and almost wild because we could do nothing to help them. I honestly believe that for a few minutes, some of us on the railroad suffered as much as those in the stream. I can see the whole thing now. You will remember Ed Hannum. He lost his wife and 4 children when we were on the railroad. He ran up and down, wringing his hands and shouting at the top of his voice. You must remember that all this occurred in a very short time, probably in 1 minute after I first saw the water. I was on the railroad, and in another minute, both shops were gone. And in less than 10 minutes from the first warning, the water had begun to recede.
Of the 30 buildings on Leeds Main Street, just 3 were left standing on their foundations. The street was crossed with deep gullies in all directions. 51 people in Leeds died.
Pauline F. Brolette, 38, and her children Isaac, 19, Osina, 16, Louis Napoleon, 15, Victor, 1. George Clancy, 3, and his sister Clara Clancy, 1. Jane Cogan, 42, and her daughters Annie Cogan, 23, and Grace Cogan, 20. Ellen Fennessy, 80, and her daughter Elizabeth Fennessy, 36, and her brother Andrew Fennessy, 49, and his wife Ellen Fennessy, 39, and their children Nellie, 10, John, 6, Katie, 3. Mary Patrick and her children Charles Patrick, 24, Mary Patrick, 23, Julia Patrick, 17. Ellen Dunley, 72, and her daughter Jane Fitzgerald, 38, and her children Charles, 20, Thomas, 10, Anna, 7, Lottie, 4, Bertha, 1. Sarah Jane Ryan, 21, and her son, Charles Ryan, 4. Hannah Hannum, 28, and her children, Bridget, 7, Edward, 4, John, 2, Michael, 5 months. Amos Dunning, 78, Mrs. Hurley, 63, Alexander Laney, 40, T.F. Vaughn, 40, Ralph Isham, 40, Sarah Shaughnessy, 38, Patrick O'Neill, 35, Samuel Davies, 30, Mary Bagley, 29, Mary Woodward, 20, Eveline Sherwood, 18, Arthur Sharpe, 17, Carrie Bonney, 16, Eliza Carpenter, 16, Mary Rouse, 12, and Terrence Dundum, 10.
No one died in Florence or Northampton. About 8:30, the torrent left Leeds, plunged over Cook's Dam, and fanned out over the wide open Florence meadows. This slowed and shrank the flood. It dropped its load and left sand and gravel 3 feet deep and covered by piles of debris up to 10 feet high. 60 bodies would be found here. Factories in Florence sustained minor damage, and the first floor of many houses were flooded. In Northampton, the banks of the Mill River were lined with people waiting for the flood. By noon, the river had settled into its natural channel and emptied into the Connecticut River, which carried debris past Holyoke, Springfield, and Hartford. That night, up in Williamsburg, Mary Hill, who lived just out of reach of the flood, wrote in her diary,
Eventful day. Arose at 7, got breakfast, and was clearing away when we heard the roar of the coming reservoir. It was so sudden, we stood like one stunned, but terribly beyond description. The worst was past in 15 or 20 minutes, but the agony of those few minutes, oh, I could do nothing the rest of the day. Of course, Mother came down at night to watch the baby, and I went out for a short time. Called on Mrs. Hitchcock, who had lost her dear husband. God bless and care for her. At home in the evening, retired, but not to sleep.
The flood had plundered an 11-mile path down the Mill Valley. All bridges were carried away except one in Northampton. Collins Graves, Fred Howard, and Jimmy Ryan all recalled the aftermath.
After the flood had passed, I did what I could in saving life and assisting those who were injured and were homeless. Everyone at that time did all he could.
As body after body was found, they were taken to the town hall in Williamsburg and to the village hall in Haydenville.
Father and I worked all day Saturday, looking for bodies. Most were found in the meadows and flats from Cook's Dam to Ross Place in Florence. Several were found near the stone bridge and back of the cookhouse and other places in the village. Father and I helped carry 5 bodies into the schoolhouse after 10 o'clock that night, none of them belonging in Leeds.
Everywhere was debris, ruined buildings, dead bodies of people, horses, pigs, and cattle. The road up home was difficult traveling due to the deep deposit of mud. It must have taken us more than an hour to get home, and then we saw no house, only the fragments of our cellar hole. Our house, 2 new barns with all stock and contents, had been swept down the valley. But we didn't care much about that. For a few minutes later, my mother and little brother came down from the hill, unharmed.
Libby Skinner remembered the plight of her horses.
Our horses were in the stable during the disaster, and afterwards they were dug out, being buried in mud and water up to their heads. They had kept themselves alive only by holding their noses above the water. All day, people poured into our house to tell of their narrow escapes.
We walked all the way to Florence that night, all our family. All day we had no food. There was none to be had. But after a while in Florence, we were given food, and later money was contributed for relief, and we were able to get a change of clothing issued to us.
The day after the flood was a Sunday. Regular church services were canceled. Instead, the first funerals were held here at the Williamsburg Congregational Church.
A little before 3 o'clock, 9 of the coffins were placed in hearses and wagons and taken from the town hall to the front of the church. Seats were arranged in the yard, and the presiding ministers had chairs on the steps. The premises were crowded. Reverend Gleason of this church spoke.
The coffins present are only a small part of the great whole, many of whom have not been found, and many might never be.
Mary Hill attended the service and walked up to Village Hill Cemetery to attend the burials. She wrote the next night.
Everything seemed like a dream.
The scene was one of woe, woe, woe. People were often speechless, and hundreds took each other by the hand silently, or passed each other in the street with simply a nod of recognition. For days, we spoke to one another only with our hands and our eyes. Men from abroad could talk, but we were well nigh speechless.
It grows worse every day as the excitement grows less. I have only to close my eyes to see it all over again.
The final toll was 139 dead and 710 destitute individuals comprising 150 families. The water had barely receded when the question of who was to blame arose. There would be a coroner's inquest that lasted 7 days and included testimony from the best engineers in the country, who pronounced the dam an abomination. Although the jury named 5 parties at fault, it recommended no indictments, no civil suits were carried out, no one was held responsible. Owners of the large factories rebuilt, except for William Skinner, whose mill and village were destroyed. He moved his silk business to Holyoke. Over time, most workers in the valley returned to their jobs. A local newspaper correspondent wrote,
"And when I heard one of the army of visitors which daily marches through this valley exclaim as he viewed the track of desolation,
I would not live here now if they would give me the whole valley.
my heart instantly replied, I had rather live with these heroes and heroines with my hut pitched on a scraped rock than anywhere else."
A newspaper summed up the local feeling.
The great majority want to stay in the town where they live.
Years later, local historian Robert Emmerich expressed what the survivors felt and what I think we feel now. The dams have been rebuilt, the bridges replaced, the roads rebuilt, and business revived. But alas, the dead are no more, they come not back, and the living, though they renew their industries, can but mourn the lost.
Perhaps the Mill River flood of 1874 was a wake-up call to the residents of this hallowed river valley, reminding us that careless industry and profiteering lead to death and destruction. Perhaps the Mill River flood of 1874 was a clarion call to live cooperatively to protect the land and water. 1 year after the flood of 1874, the pastors of this church and our Haydenville church saw what goodwill among neighbors did to revitalize for the common good. And they gave thanks for all those who contributed to the recovery efforts, the rebuilding, and the generous spirit they experienced in Williamsburg and beyond. Ultimately, they recognized divine providence at work in the unparalleled expression of sympathy in the wake of those precious lives that were lost. Perhaps this 150th anniversary of the flood is a call not just to remember the 139 souls who lost their lives, but to be steeped in gratitude for friends, loved ones, and even big-hearted strangers we have not earned and cannot buy. For communities that welcome us as we are, from wherever we have come. For houses of prayer, civic and social organizations that keep us human and encourage us in our quest for truth and justice. For all things which come to us as gifts of being from sources beyond ourselves. Gifts of life, love, and community. For this and more, we lift up our hearts and thanks on this auspicious day. And let us unite in the spirit to imagine a new world, wondering what would happen to the world if everyone believed that we all serve the same source of abundance who made heaven and earth and blesses us beyond measure. What would happen if gratitude became our primary motivator for all that we do? What would happen if the people of the world took on the heart of compassion? Because then all that has divided us will unify us. And then compassion will be wedded to power. And then gentleness will come to a world that can be hard and unkind. And then all people will be kind and forgiving. And then no one will be subject to another's will. And then the greed of some will give way to the needs of many. And then all will share equally in earth's bounty. And then all will nurture the young. And then all will restore dignity to those who are aging. And then all will live in harmony with each other's varied beliefs and religious expressions. And then we will know our common wealth relies upon the health of the land, waterways, and clean air. And then everywhere will be known as Eden once again. O Spirit of the ages, to honor the 139 who perished in the Mill River flood of 1874, help us make this dream a reality throughout this verdant valley, for your sake and for those of generations yet to come. Amen.
St. Mary of the Assumption in Haydenville was formed in 1868, 6 years before the flood. And in the history that I've been able to see, that first generation who survived the flood had a great sense of resiliency and a desire to be able to celebrate surviving such a disaster and grieving those who had lost, but also making sure that they were not forgotten, that their community would not disappear because of a human disaster, a human initiated disaster. And there was a great sense also that it was important to care for one another, that the experience of having to share with one another, the experience of having to keep each other alive and to keep each other in good health made a difference. The people who've written the history of the parish say those who survived the flood never fully recovered to be quite the people that they might have been otherwise, but that the next generation, the generation of those born after the flood, were remarkable. And those who had experienced the effects in their families, the effects in their community of all of the ways that people had cared for one another, the people had turned out for one another, all the gifts that people had given one another without counting the cost. That generation, to a remarkable extent, became people who went out into the world to make the world better. They became nurses and doctors. They became teachers. They became missionaries. They became clergy. They became, in the broadest sense of the word, builders, to make even better what had been lost, to make a world realize that it doesn't take a disaster to make us realize how much we can love one another and how much that love can change every single person. And so we give thanks to God for the gift of those 139 people who were taken away from us that day. But we also give thanks to all of those who survived for the way they persevered, for the way they taught their children to know that there is goodness in the Mill River Valley, that the people of the valley do care, and that they can show all of the world through the way they responded just what the world can do if we can love one another.
While the chorus gathers for a ballad of the Mill River flood, out of curiosity, how many of you in this room feel connected in some way to the flood? Through family relationships, through the home you live in, or the place where you work, or your familiar haunts in town? Can we see a show of hands? Thank you.
past of civil war, but war is long behind me now. My second thought, the dam for sure.
My past, Robert Cloud, we need you today. Run to the village and warn us, we pray. A soldier turned farmer, defend us again. Today is your day to be a hero. I am coming home up River Road, when from ahead a thunderous sound, and then a sight that stops me cold, a wall of mayhem bearing down. Fly fast, Jerome Hillman, we need you today. The river is sweeping our families away. To ride toward the mills, you will have to be brave. Today is your day to be a hero.
We're coming to the end of our program. When you leave to witness the important reenactment on North Main Street, please remain on the sidewalks. George Cheney's horse is going to need room in the street to turn around. After the reenactment is over and Cheney and his horse have left North Main Street, you may walk in the street. Directly in front of the church, there will be a ceremonial planting of the first 2 trees of the Flood Memorial Tree Project. Over the next 5 years, 144 trees will be planted up and down the valley, one honoring each of the 139 people killed in the flood, and one for each of the heroes who saved many lives. Gabby Immerman, in charge of the project, will supervise the planting with the help of 3rd graders from the Ann T. Dunphy School. These first trees will honor Sarah Collier Bartlett, age 24, and her daughter, Viola Collier, age 3, the first 2 victims of the flood. The program then continues with activities, some artistic, some having to do with flood resilience in the future, on the lawn of Meakin's Library across the river and also inside the library. 150 years ago, nothing would have been more natural than to end an assembly like this with a hymn. The hymn we have chosen was written in the 1860s and may have been sung in this church. It evokes a river, not the tempestuous and inadequately dammed Mill River that wreaked such havoc here, but rather a transcendent river of hope and regeneration. After the hymn, we will leave the building, front rows first. Thank you all for coming, and please rise for the hymn.